Well, a king sent troops across the sea. Said, don't you worry there for your security. But the folks back home said, hold on please, while soldiers marching here in times of peace. They remembered old rights from long ago, from the Petition of Right and the Bill of Rights, you know. They knew that freedom starts to bend when an army doesn't answer to the people again. 'Cause when the king keeps troops without consent, it's a sign of power that was meant. Standing in our streets in a time of peace and our liberty grows. But the people never said yes, then the danger only grows. 'Cause a standing army without our say can't push our rights away. So the folks stood tall and said, consent's the only way.
Hour 3 of Bill Mick Live on a Tuesday morning, this 3rd of March, 2026. Brought to you by Renewal by Anderson. Our headline at BillMick.com, Apes, Idiots, and History. We're finally getting to the history portion, although we've had some of that in our last hour as well. Nonetheless, glad you're along, and Dave Bowman with us as he brings us Dave Does History in Hour 3 of each of our Tuesdays. Taking a look at the grievances that led up to the Declaration of Independence and getting ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary thereof. And, Dave, we were doing it before the government told us we were going to have to do it.
Yes, we were. And before they even kind of suggested it.
Yeah, a slight suggestion that had the weight of penalties behind it. That was last week's show, though. Yeah.
So speaking of war powers and all that kind of stuff, the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson writes those words. He has sent standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Now, that's one of those phrases that we hear, and oftentimes our only familiarity with that theory are the commercials that Ron Paul used to do about, buy gold because it's less dangerous than a standing army or more dangerous to a standing army. And we hear those words, but we don't really understand the ontological fear that the founders had of this idea of a standing army. Now, an ontological fear, for those of you who went to high school in series, that is more than just a physical fear. We're not afraid of the physical effects of something. This is something that could impact our life, our liberty, the way we decide to live. And so there's this natural fear that we have of that idea. In colonial days, in our viewpoint, we looked at the militia as the guardian of the liberty. It was rooted in property, community, and a civil society. This was our ideals of how we would defend ourselves. We didn't see armies as necessary for aggressive, offensive actions. In fact, that was something of an unusual idea to us. Although, even as we are discussing this, one of the things we have not talked about is America's invasion of Canada in 1775. And how odd that was for us, because it wasn't the way we perceived the use of the military. We saw that militia simply as a defensive measure to guard liberty. There was this view of that was deeply tied to the community. Samuel Adams warned that soldiers were apt to consider themselves as a body distinct from the rest of the citizens if they were allowed to become, a professional standing army. They would see themselves as differently. Meanwhile, you had this other concept that a professional army was simply a grand engine of despotism. It was a completely separate order of men. We talked about the Hessians and the mercenaries a few weeks ago. I remember how they were They were basically just that's what they did. Their profession was to be soldiers. And they didn't really think about things from a body politic. They didn't think about things from a connection to land. They went where they were told to go, and they did what they were told to do. And they would be maintained during peacetime through forced taxation. Samuel Adams, as I said, warned that these soldiers would see themselves as distinct from the citizenry. And even William Blackstone would caution against creating a permanent profession of arms, because to do so would lead to the kinds of situations that we might actually end up seeing.
And we continue in just 1 minute here on Bill Mick Live. So, Dave, if I'm reading this right, it's the colonial perception of a standing army, a professional army, is they're not defenders, they're aggressors.
Well, that's not the colonial understanding of it, Bill, and this is the important part to understand. Remember that what we keep saying to Parliament and to the King is not, we don't like what you're doing. What we keep saying to him over and over again is, you are violating our rights as Englishmen.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very English understanding of the idea of the standing army. This idea that, again, a lot of this history is history that we just don't learn anymore. We just don't. Now, part of that is because we're not English, so why would we? But to the founders of this nation and to the later framers of the Constitution, this was innate to them. They knew this intimately. They understood what Charles I had done before the first, revolution when Oliver Cromwell would take over. They knew that he used his standing army, his military, to not just tax the people, but to enforce that, to make them loan him money and then use the troops to make them pay those loans. This is where quartering came in, when Charles I was sending troops into people's homes to enforce his will upon them. This led, of course, to the 1628 Petition of Rights, which limited the Crown's ability to do that to English peoples. And, of course, again, we keep saying we're English. This is why this is important.
Yeah.
When Charles I lost his head, the most interesting thing about his reign was at the beginning he was 5'8", and at the end he was 5'2". When Cromwell replaced him, there was this theory that, oh, great, now we don't have a king anymore. But Cromwell's new model army transformed this parliamentary defense force into a pure military dictatorship. It didn't go the way they expected it to go. And in 1697, John Trenchard would write that the British Constitution, the English Constitution, must either break the army or the army will destroy the Constitution, one of the two, which, of course, leads to the restoration of the monarchy, but this time we're going to put some rules on it, which James II immediately starts ignoring. He builds up a peacetime army for the sole purpose of being able to bypass Parliament so that he can do that. This leads to a series of letters by our old friend Cato, yet another Cato, who writes a whole bunch of letters that warned that nations often allowed deliverers, which initially James II was seen as, to maintain armies, only to find later on that those armies are used then to enslave them, and that's a problem. This was the situation that we would find ourselves in by 1763, where the standing armies ideas, and this is what we write, he has sent standing armies amongst us, is an anathema to us. This is a grievance that we have. Now again, we are claiming the rights of Englishmen. We are saying we are subject to the Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta, the English Constitution. And the king is violating these things by doing exactly what Charles I did. He's doing what Oliver Cromwell did. He's doing what James II did. And it was James II that you people in Parliament, you Whigs, threw out because he was doing these things. The reason you're in power today is because you got rid of James II for doing exactly the same things that George III is doing to us. Now, how can he do these things to us? Well, we're going to talk in a couple of weeks about the English Constitution, this idea that the English Constitution is English. It's not British. It's not the empire. It only applies to England, and that's kind of the way they saw it. And so they looked at it much differently, saying, look, you people need to be managed, and since you're going to be, shall we say, recalcitrant, perhaps the only way we can do this is by sending troops, because you don't seem to listen to anybody else, and we want you to do these things. But to the American mindset in 1775, this is very reminiscent, almost a historical echo, if you will, of the actions of both Charles I and James II, and to a lesser degree, even Oliver Cromwell, who, he's not really a hero in the strictest of senses. He's one of those guys that, okay, he did a good thing that we liked, but he did it in a way that was really not in the best interest of the people. And so we don't want to follow his example either. So this idea to Americans in the early colonial era, late colonial era, and the early constitutional era, the standing army is just it's a scary idea, because a standing army becomes the force of a singular person to be used by that person for the implementation of their goals, their wants, and even to the point of sending that army into a war, which is what King George III had done, and in doing so, ruin the nation, and more importantly, shatter liberty, which of course was something that we did not want to have happen.
And we continue. Protection or something else? What's that army used for? Dave will tell us as Dave Does History continues in moments on Bill Mick Live.
Dave Bowman joins us for our weekly dive into history. Pay attention, there will be a test. No, there won't be a test, but you will be held accountable. Bill Mick Live.
Thanks, Victor Lau. Renewal by Anderson brings you the hour. By the way, links to Dave's work on the show page today at BillMick.com. That title, Apes, Idiots, and History. We handled Apes and Idiots early in the show, so if you missed any of that, podcasts, top of the page at BillMick.com. And our McNugget today talking about one of those, Palm Bay's costly settlement. That'll be our McNugget at 5:30 during Hannity. So, Dave, the English history of the Army's use and purpose seems to be shifting, and the colonists are saying, we got a problem with what's happening here.
We have a problem with this because, again, this standing army is a threat to our liberty as Englishmen, and that in and of itself should be enough to cause us concern. It's also something that perhaps we should be thinking in terms of today. But how often are we?
Mm-hmm.
In 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War, as we call it, the French and Indian War, had left Britain, the nation of Britain, 122 million pounds in debt. Now, that doesn't sound like much, realistically speaking, but in today's language, you're probably talking somewhere between $17 and $20 billion worth of debt in our money. That debt was seen by the Parliament of Britain as, a huge problem. Their reaction to that, as we've talked about before, was to say, well, this entire war was fought for the benefit of the colonies in America, to get the French out of North America, to secure that land, all those kinds of things. And so they should pay for this. And pulling a page right out of Charles I, They sent 10,000 British troops to the colonial America to, quote unquote, protect Americans from whatever. Of course, the reality is this isn't protection. This is coercion. This is quartering. This is, you are sending these 10,000 troops here solely to enforce your will upon us to raise somewhere around $200,000 a year in tax, 200,000 pounds, sorry, in taxes, and force us to compensate you for your war. You know, again, there are a lot of other issues that are involved here. We don't even talk about the East India Tea Company and how it impacted all of this stuff and the reason why we don't drink tea anymore. This idea then expands itself because with the proclamation of 1763, the king said, all this new land that we have just won, you cannot occupy. And so he drew that line at the crest of the Appalachians, which cost a lot of investors, including George Washington, money. And the military quickly became a barrier to American prosperity rather than a shield against, foreign enemies. This isn't what you're trying to do. It's that military enforcement of that proclamation line that caused a lot of problems. Not only was it difficult and expensive, because really, how do you stop Americans from doing things? I mean, we tend to just do stuff. The Army, though, was sent to enforce that line. And so it was seen as just another way of the British enforcing their ideas by using a standing army against the colonies.
So the protector becomes occupier, Dave, and we got a problem.
More than that. By 1765, the king, the parliament have passed a quartering act, particularly in New York State, New York, the colony, which mandated that the colonies provide barracks, inns, specific for provisions, firewood, bedding, salt, vinegar, small casks of beer, cider, and rum for these troops. You will not only pay for these taxes.
You all want drunk soldiers around.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, New York they balked at this and said, no, we're not doing. The colonial legislature refused to comply, which led to the Parliament passing the New York Restraining Act in 1767, which was the British government viewing military necessity to shut down New York. And this is one of the other things that Jefferson writes about. He has suspended and disbanded our assemblies. It has, he's taking over these things and now he's using a standing army to do that. In Britain's eyes, in England's eyes, military necessity trumped representative government. Well, if that's not an ontological threat to liberty, what is?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we run into this idea of a social collision in all of this. There's, for lack of better phrasing, there's a 4-quadrant framework here that we're going to look at. There's a competition for labor. The soldiers were poorly paid. They had a lot of off-duty time, and so they began to moonlight for extra cash, and that undercut local people from being able to get jobs. They were seen as being servile by these troops. The civilians were constantly under surveillance by profane, drunk soldiers who were brutally disciplined by the lash, which created an environment characteristics of an army of slaves. Then you've got this 3rd quadrant, which is judicial impunity. The troops themselves could be accused of a crime, but they were protected by the military by using military courts and mock trials that were independent and superior to the civilian authorities. Does that sound familiar? That's also in the Declaration of Independence.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, there's physical violence. Street brawls and bayonet altercations between soldiers and civilians became almost routine until March 5th, 1770, when a labor dispute at a place called Gray's Rope Walk escalates into a deadly confrontation outside the customs house, leaving 5 colonials dead in what will become known as the Boston Massacre. Radical leaders like Sam Adams seized on that event, deaths portrayed as the inevitable mathematically certain result of maintaining a professional military in a civilian center. And while the judicial fallout was the subsequent acquittal of some of the troops, it just reinforced the colonial grievance that the Crown shielded its military from that punishment. So now you've got this military governor, you've got murder acts, you've got quartering acts, you've got all these things going on as a structural indictment. And eventually, victory in war might have solved the immediate threat of the French, but it didn't solve the threat to liberty.
And we pick it up with Dave Bowman. Finishing up Dave Does History. We'll take your calls on our next segment at 321-768-1240. You can also comment on the WMMB Facebook page. We continue in moments on WMMB.
Call Bill now, 321-768-1240.
Renewal by Anderson, bringing the hour. Wrapping up Dave Does History for this week. By the way, Dave's off next week. We'll resume the following week as all things get going. So you're going to take a trip. Good for you, Dave. You need to take one every now and then.
Yeah, it's just some time away with Cammie. So
that'll be great. Hey, as this is all coming together, this is becoming burdensome and unbearable on the colonists.
It's burdensome, it's unbearable, it's an ontological threat. This idea that you haven't learned the very lessons of Charles I, to a lesser degree Charles II, Oliver Cromwell, and even James II, who, by the way, you Whigs in Parliament, you got rid of. So why are you mad about us arguing the same thing? Again, in a couple of weeks, we'll get into perceptions and why perhaps they saw things differently. But at this particular point, this idea of standing armies is just, it's insane to us. And these are things that Jefferson outlines. Swarms of officers to harass our people, standing armies without the consent of the legislatures, the military independent of and superior to the civil power, quartering of large bodies of troops, protecting them by mock trials, transporting large armies of mercenaries. All these things are adding up to this indictment of George III, who is acting as a tyrant. And it's one of the things that we rebelled against. It's one of the things that we did not appreciate. Now, cutting to the chase of all this, this inherent fear that we have, this inherent dislike we have of standing armies, would lead to some of the most intense arguments that we would have, not just leading into the American Revolution, but then after the American Revolution. How do we handle this same idea to make sure that we don't make these same mistakes? Mm-hmm. In 1777, we would, of course, enact the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation prohibited peacetime professional military forces. And at the conclusion of the American Revolutionary War in 1783, we disbanded the Army. You remember George Washington's farewell address and all those kinds of things where he said goodbye to the Army, and the Army was disbanded. It was done away with. We saw militias as being the key point to all this. And by disbanding that professional army, or that we had at that point, the Continental Army, it was seen as really the moment peace was actually achieved. It wasn't beating the British at Yorktown. It was the moment that we not only won the war, but then Washington, very Cincinnatus, went home, and the Army was done away with. The problem is that this created some issues with the idea and reliability of militias. And a few years later, in 1786, Shays' Rebellion would expose the weakness of that idea that we only have a militia. It was, we're afraid of the Army, but we kind of need the Army, sort of thing. Anti-Federalists, as the Constitution was being debated, anti-Federalists like George Mason would warn that a regular army would inevitably destroy the militia, the real and natural strength of the country. And once a standing army is established in any country, he said, the people lose their liberty. On the other side of this argument is James Madison, who, of course, agrees that a standing army is one of the greatest mischiefs that can possibly happen. History teaches us that. But the most effectual way to guard against a standing army is to render it unnecessary by granting the federal government the power to regulate and call forth the militia. And it's that regulation of the militia by the federal government that is kind of a different approach to our militias today. When we put together the Constitution in 1787, the standing army argument was still hanging over us from, the Revolutionary War and from before that. And so we put together in Article 1, Section 8, this idea that we'll have a standing army, but ... we'll also have the militias. The militias will have state-appointed officers, but they will be regulated by the federal government. In addition, we will only fund any army for only 2 years maximum. So in other words, every 2 years we have to have a debate about how we're going to fund this military. This created a hybrid military system, a national army under federal control alongside the state militias, whose officers were appointed by the states. And that's one of the most important distinctions, not as big today as it was back in the 90s and early 2000s, these ideas of militias running around. Were your officers appointed by the state? Because if they weren't, then you're not a militia, you're a gang. Mm-hmm. But this idea was this hybrid thing. It was power that was physically then diffused a little bit. You still had the militias, you still had the federal control of this thing. Then we added in, just for good measure, we added in the Third Amendment in 1791, which said no quartering, and the Second Amendment. Now, again, this is not a debate about the Second Amendment, but the Second Amendment clearly says a well-regulated militia being necessary, the right to the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It clearly involves the militia in there. These are not abstract rights. These are institutional memory, which has been turned into now our laws. It's been turned into our Constitution. The Redcoats of King George were the catalyst that transformed the 13 colonies into a unified revolutionary force. The colonial objection to the standing army was fundamentally an objection to the idea that a free people should ever be governed by force. And it was a belief that our rights as Englishmen were being violated. By replacing the king's professional lobsterbacks with the body of the people, the architects of the American Republic forever tethered the defense of the nation to the preservation of liberties. Our liberties are what really matters the most. Sometimes I wonder, on days where we debate things like the War Powers Act, whether we should do something, whether we should not do something, how much those conversations involve that concept. How does this affect our liberties? Those are questions that each person has to answer for themselves, each person has to address for themselves. But the truth is, if it impacts our liberties negatively, we probably shouldn't be doing it. And I guarantee you that's what both James Madison, George Washington would tell you today, if you want to know how the framers and the founders would have felt about it. It's not that they would have thought it was a bad idea. They would have said, if this is a threat to liberty, it's bad. And it's not what we fought for.
And we get to your calls momentarily, 321-768-1240 if you want in. Let's get to the phones for Dave Bowman as we wrap up Dave Does History on a Tuesday. Keith is in Palm Bay. Hey, Keith, good morning.
Hey, good morning, guys. And, rest in peace the troops that have already passed, and hopefully none more pass. But anyways, to what you were talking about, Dave, just a question. I mean, how did these societies build? Were they crown sponsored, privately sponsored, or investor sponsored? And then were they taxed different? I mean, how did the communities come up with these taxes with their constituents?
Thanks, Keith. Dave?
Well, initially, when the colonials first began to immigrate from England to the New World, yes, they would be sponsored. Whether the king sponsored them, hence, you got Jamestown sponsored by King James. You have Virginia named after the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth. You have those kinds of things. So yes, there was some sponsorship involved. There were some companies involved with that. By the 1760s, by the time of the American Revolution, that has long since passed. These are royally chartered colonies. They are, because of a policy of what's known as statutory neglect, they are essentially allowed the rights of Englishmen to rule themselves, and that's what they do. They have these colonial legislatures, which determine the necessity of hey, we need a road over here. How are we going to pay for that? Well, let's tax whatever at certain rates. It's that principle of taxation with representation that really is the issue in all of this. And by the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, we were starting to be excluded from those ideas. The concept of statutory neglect went away. The king and parliament began to see the colonies not as English, but as potential sources of revenue. And, there's a lot of discussion about the Boston Tea Party and, we didn't want to pay the tax on tea. No, we didn't want to drink the tea at all, because even though the tea was technically cheaper than the smuggled tea that we were drinking, it was the principle of a tax without our own agreement, without our representation. That's why we dumped it. So by this point, all that kind of stuff had gone away, but we were used to legislating and ruling ourselves. The British, starting in 1763, began to undo that. And again, using a standing army became that ontological threat. That should be your word for the day. Ontological threat to our liberty, which we did not like. Rightfully so.
Dave, you mentioned the Boston Tea Party. You mentioned the Boston Massacre. How frequent were these interactions between these quartered or standing troops and the citizenry that were negative in nature, that were these problems that led to this? Was that a regular occurrence in these cities?
Yeah. And we know about the Boston Massacre because it was amplified by Paul Revere and Sam Adams and John Adams. Other events that didn't necessarily result in deaths were fairly common. It was not unusual to hurl insults at lobsterbacks, as they were called because of their red coats. There was a lot of conflict and a lot of anger towards the standing army because they were seen as a threat to liberty.
Dave Bowman, thank you much, sir. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. I enjoyed doing it. Looking forward to 2 weeks from today with Evacuation Day.
Check out more stories from history at davedoeshistory.org.
From the quartering act bills to the troops in town, from New York's fight to Boston's showdown, when soldiers rule and laws get shoved, that's not protection, that's being pushed from above. So the people cried out, this isn't right, civil power must hold the light. 'Cause when the army stands above the law, you can feel your freedom start to fall. Standing in our streets in a time of peace, that's not how liberty grows. If the people never said yes, then the danger only grows. 'Cause a standing army without our say can't push our rights away. So the folks stood tall and said, consent's the only way. protection of their liberty. No more armies without our voice, 'cause government comes from the people's choice. And later on, when the nation formed, they built protections into the norm, like the Third Amendment saying loud and clear, no soldiers in your home unless the law says here. Standing in our streets in a time of peace, there's not our liberty grows. If the people never said yes, then the danger only grows. So they built a system to keep us free, where the army answers to you and me, and that's how freedom learns to stay. Consent's the only